This is their new album. It's called One More Light. It comes out tomorrow. Here with the title track dedicated to Chris Cornell, Linkin Park.
Thank you very much. We were going to come out and play heavy first, but in light of our dear friend Chris Cornell passing away, we decided to play our song One More Light in honor of him to start this off. We love you, Chris. Should have stayed were the signs I ignored.
On May 19th, 2017, Chester Bennington, the lead singer of post-grunge hard rock band Linkin Park, appeared on Jimmy Kimmel Live to promote their latest album, One More Light. Bennington was in a noticeably somber mood on stage as one of his good friends, Chris Cornell, who himself was a lead singer for Soundgarden and Audioslave, had just died by suicide the previous day. Bennington and Cornell had become friends about a decade earlier when their bands toured together in the mid-2000s and famously duetted with each other during the Project Revolution tour. Chester joined Cornell to Temple of the Dog's Hunger Strike, and Cornell joined Bennington on Linkin Park's Crawling. But the friendship went beyond professional courtesies on stage. Chester was godfather to Cornell's son, Christopher, and by all accounts, the two men shared a close personal friendship. Upon hearing the news, Bennington remarked on his Instagram account that he could not imagine a world without Cornell in it. On top of this, the lyrics to One More Light are about the loss of a close friend, and his fellow bandmates were keenly aware of the emotional toll of the news on their lead singer, who struggled with the song and kept getting choked up during the rehearsal for the Kimmel appearance. Just a week later, Bennington sang a stirring rendition of Leonard Cohen's song Hallelujah at Cornell's funeral in Los Angeles.
When it goes like this, the fourth, the fifth, the minor fall, and the major lift, the baffled king composing hallelujah, 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 hallelujah.
It was very clear to the people closest to him that Chester was struggling with the loss. The singer had struggled with depression and substance abuse issues in the past. Cocaine and methamphetamines were his drugs of choice for years, but seemed to be winning his battle with addiction, even going on to warn about the perils of drug use in interviews. He attributed part of his success in battling these demons to an intervention staged by his bandmates, noting in 2011 that he quit drinking and saying, quote, "I just don't want to be that person anymore." But it wasn't always a smooth road, even after he kicked his most serious habits. In 2016, Bennington reportedly attempted suicide, but had a change of heart and decided not to go through with it. And his battle with depression would never completely recede from his life, but the singer was introspective and reflective about managing his mental health struggles and staying busy enough to keep the darker feelings at bay. He considered spending time with his family and working on his music to be saving graces in his life, saying, quote, "If I'm not actively getting out of myself and being with other people, like being a dad, being a husband, being a bandmate, being a friend, helping someone out, if I'm out of myself, then I'm great. If I'm inside all the time, then I'm horrible. I'm a mess." Still, despite his past struggles and the risk of a relapse always looming for addicts confronted with emotionally upsetting situations like the death of a loved one or a close friend, Bennington actually had a lot to be excited about in his life. His band was currently on a world tour for its latest album, and despite some mixed reviews, they were enjoying a bit of a renaissance. After selling more than 100 million albums and winning a slew of awards, the band was starting to be recognized as one of the most important groups of the 2000s. MTV2 named Linkin Park the third best band of the new millennium, and although they hadn't always been appreciated, many found the music somewhat derivative of earlier grunge and nu metal acts. The close association with grunge legend Cornell had perhaps legitimized Bennington and Linkin Park as part of that storied lineage, rather than just late-period posers. By July, the dark cloud of depression after Cornell's death seemed to have passed a bit. The band performed in Birmingham, England on July 6th in front of thousands of fans, ripping through 26 songs in a rocking show that featured Bennington touching fans' hands and becoming emotional once again while singing One More Light as a tribute to Cornell. A little more than a week later, on July 14th, Bennington was laughing hysterically with his bandmates and Ken Jeong for an episode of Carpool Karaoke.
I had a dream last night that I was a part of Linkin Park, and I successfully changed the name to Linkin Park, K-E-N Park.
Nice.
Huh?
So you just come in and you take over the band.
Yeah.
I love it.
And nothing seemed amiss. Shortly after the recording, Bennington and his family, wife Talinda, a former Playboy model, and their 3 children, took a vacation in Phoenix, Arizona as a brief respite from the grind of the world tour. Bennington left early to return to California to film a television commercial, but seemed to be in good spirits. On July 20th, he was found dead by the housekeeper in their Palos Verdes home. Chester Bennington was just 41 years old. I'm Derek Kaufman.
I'm Jason Beckerman.
And this is Last Days, Chester Bennington.
According to the autopsy report, Chester Bennington died by hanging and was discovered with a black Hugo Boss leather belt around his neck and a ligature mark around his neck as well. The housekeeper told officials she'd last seen him around 10:30 p.m. the night before, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She said Chester mentioned that he would be leaving for work the next morning around 4:30 in the morning. When she returned at 8:30 a.m., she found him unresponsive and hanging from the doorframe in the bedroom, prompting her to immediately call 911. His boarding pass from the flight to Phoenix was still in his pocket, along with a few loose coins. As we discussed, the medical examiner noted that Chester had had a history of suicidal ideation. There had been a recent attempt in 2016, and Talinda told investigators there was another in 2006 when Chester left his home with a gun after a night of heavy drinking. She also said that Chester was currently in an outpatient treatment program, and a month before his death, he'd reportedly told friends that he'd been sober for 6 months. However, there was a half-full bottle of Corona on the nightstand in his bedroom, along with an empty bottle of Stella Artois in the bathroom. Talinda mentioned that, although Chester had been prescribed antidepressants, he had not used them in over a year and only occasionally took Ambien to help with sleeping issues. There were also some fingernail pieces on a table attached to a sofa in the bedroom, which Talinda told officials was something Chester did when he felt anxious. Also in the room was what officials described as an undated, quote, journal with a handwritten apparent biography. It's not believed that this was a specific suicide note, as it was undated and not clear when it was written. The toxicology report showed only a trace amount of alcohol in his system and a, quote, presumptive positive test for MDMA, another word for ecstasy. Subsequent tests did not detect the drug, and it's not believed that Bennington was under the influence of drugs when he died. Given the amount of alcohol detected in his blood, just 0.054%, it doesn't seem like he was excessively drunk at the time either.
So what exactly happened to Chester Bennington? Here was a 41-year-old man in good physical health who'd experienced a ton of success, had a beautiful family at the time of his death. And the answer, sadly, when you break it all down, seems to be depression. Although she obviously knew about his struggles with mental health and sobriety, his wife Talinda was completely blindsided by his death, saying, quote, this was not a time where we or any of our family suspected this to happen, which is terrifying. We thought everything was okay. And Chester was open about his struggles with depression and seemed to have developed tools for managing these bouts of it over the years. Just a few months earlier, in February 2017, Chester told a radio station, quote, this place right here, this skull between my ears, that is a bad neighborhood, and I should not be in there alone. I can't be in there by myself. It's insane. It's crazy in here. This is a bad place for me to be by myself. And so when I'm in that, my whole life gets thrown off. I don't say nice things to myself. There's another Chester that wants to take me down. And in an interview just 2 months before his death, he said, quote, clinical depression is something that you actually can't get out of. You need to see a doctor. You have to get medicated for it. You need to go to therapy. There's these things you need to do in order to get out of it, or else you won't, and you're just in it. It's not like, oh man, I don't like that, I'm just bummed. It's like, I don't want to do anything, and I don't feel like doing anything, and I don't like anything. There's no sunshine. I mean,
it's just hard.
It's hard to hear the words.
It's hard to hear the words, especially, obviously, we know what transpired so shortly after. It's difficult to hear it. It's impossible to know precisely what was going through his mind, obviously. But the scene in these open and honest interviews really do start to paint a picture of a man at the depths of depression, can't get out. We've visited this many times, right, during the course of this podcast and our own personal lives. We know people have struggled with depression, and it's easy when you don't struggle with it to look at people and say, just snap out of it. And when you're in it, it is all-consuming and it is impossible to emerge from it.
Yeah, he spoke so eloquently about it in these interviews that you're right. It starts to paint this picture of a guy who is wrestling with these demons and knowing that, fully aware that he had a great life by all accounts. He had a lot of money. He had a beautiful family. He had a Playboy model wife. I mean,
beyond being attractive, they seem to have a true love affair. They seem to really care about each other deeply, and he seemed to be a doting husband, father?
Yes, and what we'll get into here is when he was away from them, when he couldn't be outside of his head, he really, really struggled. That's when the intrusive thoughts and the negativity really came into his life. And as I mentioned, he had left to go do a commercial shoot during a family vacation and said, I'm just going to pop off to the side here, do this work obligation, and probably circle back with the family, and really never did because the depression just sunk in.
It seems like he's the kind of guy who needed a very specific construct around him in order to live positively, but he lived a rock star lifestyle, and that means traveling, and that means doing commercial gigs, and that means singing on stage and all these other things, and that it's inconsistent.
Yeah, I think you're right. A structured life of going to an office every day might have suited him, but he's a rock star.
Or even
that's not the way life goes.
Right, exactly. That's not the way life goes. There are some telltale signs of, or maybe there's some indicia of what exactly happened and the kind of state he was in. You mentioned earlier that the fingernails on the table near the sofa gave some indication that he was anxious in the moment. Suicide can sometimes be an impulsive act, but the beer bottles and fingernails seem to suggest he was pondering things in the moments leading up to his death. Second, his wife mentioned that he had not used his prescribed antidepressants in over a year, a comment that stands in contrast to that interview before his death when he mentioned the need for medication and therapy to manage his bouts of depression.
And I wanted to pause on that. When you take antidepressants, they build up in your system, and you need to consistently be on that regimen.
You can't take it when you feel depressed.
That's right. They're not just pills you pop when you're feeling depressed.
Yeah. Third, and perhaps most tragically, he was alone in the house that night, having just flown back without his family, and this may have been the worst possible thing for him. He was still dealing with the depression from losing his good friend Chris Cornell a couple of months earlier, and he'd said earlier that being alone in his own head was, quote, a bad place for him to be. It's also worth mentioning that he died on what would have been Cornell's 53rd birthday, and sometimes anniversaries and birthdays can trigger painful memories for people who already have depressive tendencies.
It's really just an incredibly sad story because in public, what you would see from Chester Bennington was real sincere sadness over the death of Chris Cornell, who is a legend of the grunge movement, and they had a true friendship. When they're singing on stage, and you can hear in these clips, if you watch them on YouTube, there's a real bond between them. They were both musicians who were very sensitive in some ways, and you could see that come through their music, and it may have just been overwhelming for him.
The thing that stands out for me most is how introspective he was, how in touch with his feelings he was, how acutely aware of his depression he was, how he tried to talk through it and knew what it took to manage that depression. It didn't mean he had a handle on it. Obviously, he didn't. It cost him his life. But he was nevertheless a man who was, again, acutely aware of what he was going through in his efforts to, cure himself of it or get out from underneath it, and he just couldn't do it.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and take a quick break, and when we come back, more on Chester Bennington's legacy. The response to the news of Bennington's death immediately swept through the music and entertainment world. Still reeling from the loss of Cornell just a couple months earlier, many celebrities and fans of the band were struggling to just make sense of it all. A little over a month after his death, Jared Leto gave a moving tribute to both Bennington and Cornell at the 2017 MTV Video Music Awards.
MTV asked me to come here today to say a few words about Chester and the late, great Chris Cornell, two artists that I had the absolute pleasure of touring with. They were close friends with one another, Chester even singing a cover of the classic Hallelujah at Chris's funeral. Chester was my friend, as he was to so many, and witnessing his life taught me important things, especially about working relentlessly, pursuing dreams, and being kind and caring while doing it.
And when you hear that, you really do. They're always going to be linked, Jason, because the timing was such that these two massive rock stars in kind of similar genres
who are also
away
best friends
from suicide together in a short span of months, and they were together on stage constantly. You're right; they were very close friends, so it's always going to be linked in people's minds. And so the outpouring was expected, but also quite moving. And Linkin Park itself put on a tribute concert for their late singer in Los Angeles in October, featuring performances from Blink-182, System of a Down, Korn, Sum 41, and Yellow Card. And several other artists who'd worked with or just admired Linkin Park, including Jay-Z and Imagine Dragons, also paid their respects over the coming months. Here's Chris Martin from Coldplay at a show in New York just a couple weeks after Bennington's death. reason I pulled that clip is it's easy to think of Linkin Park as just a hardcore rock band, but they really crossed over. Coldplay is nothing like Linkin Park in terms of their sound, but their influence was much broader than just a heavy rock band or a new metal band. And it's interesting to hear Chris Martin actually pay respects to someone like
I would
Linkin
go so
Park.
far as to say that Coldplay is the opposite of Linkin Park.
I would say I wanted to be more diplomatic about it, but they are as opposite as you can sound. Right? You've got a guy at a piano singing weepy love songs. It's not exactly what Linkin Park did. And during the 2018 Grammy Awards, rapper Logic performed his hit song 1-800-273-8255 as a tribute to Cornell and Bennington. The song's title is, of course, a reference to the phone number for the suicide prevention hotline, so people were really trying to make some awareness out of these two tragedies.
For a certain generation, Linkin Park looms very large in rock history. The band is simply one of the most successful acts of the 2000s, blending elements of hip-hop, modern rock, and electronica into their music through the interplay of Bennington's soaring and emotionally intense vocals and Mike Shinoda's rapping. During a time when nu metal was professing rage and debauchery, Bennington's lyrics brought an emo element to heavy guitar riffs that paved the way for bands like Fall Out Boy and Paramore that would follow the success of Linkin Park. The BBC's Steve Holden said Bennington's raw openness made him, quote, the voice of a generation, and Ben Beaumont-Thomas of The Guardian added, his cleanly articulated tales of emotional struggle gave millions a sense that someone understood them. And the numbers back them up. The band sold over 100 million records worldwide, won 2 Grammy Awards, 6 American Music Awards, and a raft of other honors. The Grammys are important as well. This is not a band that went Grammy seeking. It's not a band that appealed to sort of, we've talked a lot in recent years about the old white stiffs that manned the Grammys for years. Things are changing a bit. But this is not a band that appealed to those folks, yet nevertheless, they won over a lot of converts through their, couple decades playing together.
They really did. I confess, I'm from a bit of an earlier generation of grunge fans like Nirvana, but to see the response in our newsroom when Chester Bennington passed away was eye-opening for me and for Jason as well, because there are a lot of people who were very, very shaken by the news of his death, and he just looms very, very large in the music scene. I see him as a bit of a bridge between eras where you had sort of harder heroin kind of nodding down like Nirvana type music. And then you got to the emo Fall Out Boy guys who were singing all about their feelings. And you had in the middle, you had Linkin Park sort of bridging the two worlds, right?
Yeah, I think that's about right. A couple little anecdotes. First, we have this email that people can send emails in with their suggestions of what they want to do. Also, people post comments all the time on various YouTube and elsewhere. And I think that Chester Bennington's death is the one that we hadn't talked about, that most people had written in about.
Yes.
And it's amazing to me because, like you, I'm a little bit old for Linkin Park to have been really resonant with me, but I'm certainly aware of them, and you hear their songs and you sort of say, oh, that song and that song. It's one of those bands that you might not know. You may list their top 10 songs, but you hear any of the top 10, you know exactly what the song is. But they are insanely popular. They're bigger than I think I ever gave them credit for. The other thing is that I have my wife's got a bunch of cousins who are about 5 to 7 years younger than me, and this is their band. Like maybe Nirvana was for my generation, Linkin Park was for theirs, and they are bigger than I think they get credit for. They're not mentioned in that echelon, but I think they're every bit part of it.
I think you're exactly right. And even if they weren't your cup of tea, Linkin Park was just gigantic. And some of their songs, like In the End, as you hear that on the radio, they're just undeniable. And Chester's vocals really were what made everything work.
I tried so hard and got so far, but in the end, it doesn't even matter. I had to fall to lose it all.
It's hard to imagine the band moving on without Bennington. He was simply the heart and soul of that sound. Without him, it just doesn't really work. Which is maybe why in April 2022, nearly 5 years after his death, fellow bandmate Mike Shinoda told fans that the band had no current plans of recording a new album or touring at all. And we've talked about this in the context of Keith Moon with The Who. There's certain guys that are members of bands and they're so central to that sound that going on after that person passes away. Led Zeppelin had the same thing with John Bonham. You may have other versions of the band, but it's going to be hard to recapture that.
And it's not just sort of pining away for the days of yore. It's somebody whose voice is so distinct and identified with the band. It's just it's not the same band anymore without him.
That's exactly right. And perhaps the most profound tribute to Chester Bennington came from one of the unlikeliest sources, Limp Bizkit frontman Fred Durst. As we mentioned before, Linkin Park's sound was partly an outgrowth of nu metal bands like Limp Bizkit, and although Bennington's band often strived for and delivered more meaningful lyrics than Durst's hits like Break Stuff and Nookie, there was actually quite a bit of overlap between their musical sensibilities, which led to a real and genuine friendship between the two singers. And so I thought it only fitting to give Fred the final word, where he said, "I can say so many wonderful things about the Chester I knew. He had a way of making anyone he spoke to feel heard, understood, and significant. His aura and spirit were contagious and empowering. Often those types of people have so much pain and torture inside that the last thing they want is to contaminate or break the spirit of others. He would go out of his way to make sure you knew he truly cares. As real and transparent as our conversations would be, he was always the one projecting light on the shadows. I want to hug him now and let him know that we all experience our own pain and deal with it in our own ways. I know his torture is unique to him, but I would always be here to listen and help in any way I can. But I won't get that hug in that moment now, which makes me so sad."